Hi, I'm Anna, and welcome back to the D2 Audible cheat sheets. In episode 1, we talked about the first engine of price, supply and demand. Today, we move to the second engine, costs. Not in the abstract, but as they stack, step by step, from vineyard to the point where someone finally taps a card at the register. Think of a bottle of wine as a relay race. The baton passes from grape grower to winery to freight to importer to retailer or restaurant. At every handoff, there are real costs. And for the chain to work, every runner needs a margin that keeps them alive. That's what we're doing today. We're going to walk with the supply chain, listen for where money is actually spent, and understand why the same cost line item can mean almost nothing for one wine and everything for another. The supply chain is simply the network of organizations and activities involved from the creation of a product through to its distribution and sale to the final consumer. In an ideal world, the retail price covers the cost at every stage and still leaves a reasonable profit for everyone involved. But the relative weight of each cost depends on the wine. That's the trick. Costs are not universal, they are contextual. In wine, grape growing is the first stage of the supply chain, whether the business grows its own fruit or buys it. And the cost of grape growing falls into two buckets: capital costs and operating costs. Capital is money invested to generate income. Capital costs are what you spend to acquire or improve long term assets like land, buildings, equipment. Operating costs are the day to day costs of producing and packaging wine. Now, here's the first storytelling moment that matters. Before a single grape is harvested, the biggest cost may already have happened: the land. Land price can differ wildly inside the same country and even within the same region. A vineyard in Napa can cost around 10 times more than land in California's Central Valley. In Bordeaux, land is in the best parts of the Medoc can reach around 100 times the price of land in the generic Bordeaux appellation. That gap isn't just economics, it's reputation, proven track record for quality, and the name that can be printed on the label. Scarcity amplifies it. In places like Champagne, land rarely comes to market, and when it does, it sells to the highest bidder. And where geographical indications limit where a wine can legally come from, supply of eligible land is capped. If the GI is small, the ceiling is low and the pressure is high. Once land is secured, the vineyard still isn't a vineyard yet. It's a site that needs to be made operational, and that list gets expensive fast. Surveying and assessing suitability, deciding what grapes belong there, clearing land, building access roads, buying and planting vines, stakes and wires for trellising, drainage if waterlogging is a risk, irrigation infrastructure in dry areas, which can mean boreholes, reservoirs, pumps, pipes, and delivery systems. Protection against weather hazards like wind, hail, frost. Protection from animals using fences or netting. Machinery like tractors and sprayers and harvesters, and somewhere to store them. Some producers buy, others hire equipment only when needed because it's too expensive to own something that sits idle most of the year. All of that is capital cost, and it's not helped by one frustrating biological fact. Vines take at least 3 years to produce. So you spend and you wait, which means funding becomes part of cost. If the owner can't self fund, they need loans with interest and repayments that live inside the business plan, or investors who expect return on investment and sometimes a hand on the steering wheel. In some countries, governments help with subsidies, either through tax incentives or lump sums, because they want vineyards established for broader agricultural or regional reasons. Then, even before the vines give fruit, vineyard management costs begin, and they don't stop. Labor is usually the loudest one. The amount of labor needed depends on vineyard size, topography, and farming choices. Steep Mosel vineyards, where mechanization is impossible, demand far more labor per hectare than flat vineyards like California's Central Valley. Organic and biodynamic farming generally increases labor too because you replace some chemical shortcuts with more hands on work and more passes through the vineyard. Excuse me. There's always a balance between labor cost and the capital cost of machinery. In places with low labor costs like Chile, there's less incentive to invest in expensive machines. In places where labor is expensive or hard to find, like Coonawarra, machinery becomes more appealing. And vineyards don't just need labor, they need different labor at different times. Harvest teams can be relatively unskilled and trained quickly, but if pickers are scarce, they will go to whoever pays best. The rest of the year requires fewer people but more skill, often managed by a vineyard manager. If a vineyard uses machinery, headcount may fall, but the remaining staff need training to run equipment properly. Then there's machinery maintenance and fuel. Supplies like trellis repair materials, shears, gloves, vineyard treatments. Conventional farming uses agrochemicals such as herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. Integrated pest management can reduce chemical use, but it may require access to regularly updated weather information to anticipate disease pressure. If a vineyard is too small to justify its own weather station, it may pay for access to one run by government services. Organic and biodynamic growers still incur treatment costs too, using traditional materials like sulfur or Bordeaux mix. Water matters, especially where irrigation is used. Producers may pay authorities for extraction rights or pay for water, and in dry years, rising irrigation water prices can tip grape growing into unprofitability. Electricity can be another line item. Powering irrigation systems, bird scarers, and some frost protection equipment. Add insurance against risks like fire or flood and depreciation because tractors, trellising, and systems like drainage and frost protection wear out and need replacement. Depreciation is accounting's way of acknowledging that reality. Now we move to winemaking costs, and the logic repeats. There are capital costs to establish the winery and operating costs to run it and produce wine. Winery establishment can involve purchasing land, constructing the building, and fitting it out with equipment such as presses, tanks, pumps and pipes, refrigeration, maturation vessels, and possibly a bottling line. If the wine will be sold in bulk or if the estate hires a mobile bottling line, that changes the equation. Funding again can come from the owner, loans, or investors. Operating costs in the winery begin with a pivotal decision. Do you grow your own grapes or buy fruit? If you buy grapes, fruit cost becomes a major variable, changing with grape variety, quality, and vintage. And if you need to hit a low price point, there's a practical lever. Blend cheaper varieties such as Iron, Uni Blanc, Colombard, or Semillon with a more expensive variety like Chardonnay to bring costs down. Labor in the winery is typically a small base of skilled staff year round, with extra casual help around harvest for physical tasks like unloading and moving equipment. Equipment running costs include fuel, electricity, and maintenance. Winery materials include things like sugar for enrichment, deacidification agents, acid for acidification, cultured yeast, inert gases such as carbon dioxide, and fining and filtering agents. Water is a real cost because wineries use large volumes for cleaning. Where water is scarce or expensive, some wineries invest in water treatment plants to reuse water. Electricity is required for refrigeration, ventilation, presses, pumps, and lighting. And some estates generate some or all of their electricity, for example, with solar panels. Then, maturation. This is where the romance of wine becomes a spreadsheet. Storage costs, space costs money. Maturation vessels cost money. New oak barrels from top producers can be extremely expensive, and buying them annually can be a substantial cost. Second hand barrels reduce cost but contribute little flavor. Oak chips or staves can be a cheaper option than barrels but still add cost. Maturation also requires labor to monitor the process. And there's a long term cost that doesn't look like a cost at first. Cash flow. Money gets tied up in stock that cannot be sold yet. Many barrel matured wines are released 1 to 2 years after harvest, but some require far longer. Brunello di Montalcino, for example, can only be released from January 5 years after harvest. That's a long time to have money sitting quietly in a cellar instead of paying bills or funding growth. Packaging is next. If the winery bottles its own wine, it buys bottles, closures, labels, cartons, and pallets. Heavy bottles and elaborate labeling cost more. Bottling requires a bottling line, which is expensive and may not make sense if used once a year. So some estates hire a bottling line with operators when needed, or send wine to another facility and pay to use their equipment. Label and bottle design can also be a cost, whether in house or outsourced. Depreciation returns here too, because presses and equipment eventually need replacing. Some budgets group water, electricity, and depreciation as seller overheads. And then, crucially, even after all production costs are counted, the winery still has non production costs and needs a producer margin for profitability. This is where two wines comparison, as shown in the textbook, becomes a lens for the entire unit. Imagine a high volume, inexpensive branded Chardonnay. Its margin per unit is tiny, but it relies on high volume and efficiency. To produce at scale, the business might invest in expensive equipment like a centrifuge or cross flow filter because the cost can be spread across huge volumes. That's economy of scale, and it keeps the final retail price low enough to compete. Now imagine a low volume, super premium Cabernet Sauvignon. It's the opposite. With few bottles to sell, expensive investment in equipment and storage must be recouped through a higher margin per bottle. There is minimal economy of scale, so the retail price ends up high. The textbook examples are not numbers you need to memorize for exams, but they show the shape of reality. When grape growing costs are calculated per 9-liter case, the high volume Chardonnay example is dramatically lower than the low volume Cabernet. The single biggest difference is labor, because super premium fruit typically involves more vineyard interventions, more manual work, smaller scale, lower yields, and fewer opportunities to spread cost. In that same example, real estate tax is far higher for the super premium wine, reflecting much higher land value, and depreciation is higher too, reflecting more expensive long term systems like irrigation, drainage, frost protection, and trellising. When total winemaking costs are compared per 9-liter case, grape growing costs can still represent roughly 70% of total production cost for both wines, despite huge differences in total cost. The major additional winemaking cost for the super premium wine is oak, because high quality barrels, often with a high proportion of new oak, are used and replaced after several years. Cellar overheads are also higher because the wine may be matured far longer and requires more cellar space, particularly when aging in individual barrels rather than in bulk. Packaging quality typically rises too, with better glass, better closures, and higher end labels and case packaging. And because these costs are spread over fewer bottles, they bite harder. Up to now, we've been inside the producer. Now, we leave the winery, and the supply chain becomes literal movement. Once wine is bottled, unless it's sold directly to consumers at cellar door, it must travel. Most wine is transported in bottle, packaged in boxes, stacked in crates and pallets, and moved by freight forwarders. The wine trade often uses specialist freight forwarders because wine is fragile. Bottles break. Wine can spoil with heat, sunlight, or excessive vibration. Some forwarders reduce risk with temperature controlled containers, which are very expensive. There are four main transport modes for wine in bottle, and as a rough guide, they move from most expensive to least expensive: air, road, rail, and sea. Air freight is expensive and heavily weight dependent, which makes wine a poor candidate except for special cases. Very high value wines, urgent deadlines, samples for competition, or time sensitive shipments like Beaujolais Nouveau to Japan. Road is efficient for short distances, especially when it can go directly from winery to delivery point. For long distances, it becomes excessively expensive. Rail cost depends on the route and loading. Containerization can reduce handling cost and improve viability. Sea freight is usually by far the cheapest per kilometer for long distances, but it is slow. A shipment from Australia to the UK can take around 40 days. So importers must plan ahead for peak trading periods. Then there's bulk transportation, which has grown significantly over the past 2 decades. Bulk wine moves in flexi tanks inside standard containers or in ISO tanks. Bulk transportation is cheaper because liquid in tank is far lighter than liquid in glass, and it is more efficient. A standard container holds roughly 9 to 10,000 liters of bottled wine, while the largest flexi tanks can carry up to 24,000 liters, and ISO tanks up to 26,000. That means more than double the volume in the same size container, less fuel per liter, and a lower environmental footprint. The limitation is that bulk only works for large volumes of the same wine, so it suits supermarkets and major brands, not small production wines. Bulk still tends to be used for cheaper wine, which is why it can represent a large share of export volume but a smaller share of export value, though there is increasing interest in bulk shipping for more expensive wines too. And whatever the route, insurance matters. The party that carries the risk for loss or damage should insure the goods. Often the sender insures the next point in the chain, and then the responsibility shifts. Specialist freight forwarders reduce risk and may offer insurance as a service. Now we reach the importation cost. Importing adds cost beyond transport. Custom duties and taxes are part of it, and labeling laws can create hidden friction. Different markets have different requirements. For example, in the EU, alcohol by volume must be shown to the nearest whole or half unit, whereas in the USA, the permitted variance is wider, meaning US wines may need relabeling for the EU. The USA also requires health warnings that must be added to wines entering the country. Producers selling into multiple markets may need multiple label versions, which increases cost compared to selling into a single harmonized market. This complexity explains why many producers use distributors to handle foreign markets. Importers know local rules, have established client networks, and manage compliance, but they charge a margin. Margin is the fee that covers operating cost and profit, typically represented or expressed as a percentage. Then comes sales cost at the retail end of the chain, and this is where the romance really collapses into rent. Property costs are significant. Retailers may buy premises which requires major capital, often funded through loans or mortgages, or they may lease, which reduces upfront cost but commits them to rent and other expenses and the possibility of relocation later. Bars and restaurants often need prime locations which are expensive, and whether buying or leasing, they must spend on fit out and branding. Running costs then follow: maintenance, security, water, energy, insurance, and in some places, commercial property taxes and water disposal. Online only retailers can reduce property costs because warehousing is typically cheaper and located away from city centers. Labor costs vary by outlet. Supermarkets have relatively low labor costs because wine expertise is not essential on the shop floor. Specialist wine retailers employ knowledgeable staff to advise customers so wages are higher. Bars and restaurants require more staff to serve, clean, and wash up, so labor costs are higher again. In fine dining, staff are expected to be highly knowledgeable, and the head sommelier role is prestigious and can command high salaries. Equipment and materials differ too. A wine shop needs basics like a till system, shelving, and perhaps refrigeration. Restaurants require kitchen and bar equipment, tableware, and glassware. Many on trade venues invest in preservation systems so wine by the glass does not oxidize after opening. Storage costs matter, whether that's fridges to maintain cellar temperature, external storage when space is limited, or centralized warehouses used by large chains to distribute stock to branches. Delivery costs are one of the most expensive parts of the supply chain. Wine is heavy and fragile, so shipping to consumers is costly. Consumers may pay a delivery fee, but many retailers believe customers won't pay the full cost. That's why fixed delivery fees are common, even if some deliveries cost the retailer more than the fee charged. Some retailers offer free delivery over a threshold, using it as a discount without lowering the wine sticker price. And then there's the retailer margin. A retailer must make profit to survive. Specialist wine retailers often look for margins in the range of 30 to 50%. Bars and restaurants may apply much higher margins, sometimes around two-thirds, meaning the wine is sold for roughly three times what the venue paid. That higher margin helps cover higher operating costs. Margins are often higher on wine sold by the glass because of the risk of spoilage once a bottle is opened. Marketing costs also feed into price. Larger producers may employ in house marketing teams. Smaller producers may outsource campaigns to agencies. Some producers belong to associations or trade bodies that market collectively, funded by a levy on members' sales value, which becomes part of the cost structure. Design and production of bottles and labels costs money. Marketing campaigns cost money. Samples sent to tastings or competitions are stock given away rather than sold. Price promotions are common in large retailers, and the cost is often borne by the producer. Many small producers succeed with minimal marketing spend, but big brands can run expensive campaigns that become part of the final price. Legislation can increase costs through taxes, duties, trade barriers, subsidies, minimum pricing, and labeling laws. Producers can't opt out, but sometimes they can choose how to comply. And the textbook gives a very practical example from the UK. Excise duty is payable on wine entering the country unless it is stored in a bonded warehouse. An importer can pay duty immediately and store wine themselves, or store in bond and pay duty only when the wine is released for sale. Bonded storage costs money, but it can protect cash flow by delaying duty payments. Legal factors also influence market entry. If duty is too high or labeling laws are too onerous, a producer may decide they can't compete and focus elsewhere. This is why, for example, relatively few mid priced US wines appear in the EU compared to wines from countries that benefit from trade agreements. Finally, currency fluctuations affect cost when wine moves between countries. And the textbook illustrates how a bottle priced X seller at 2 Australian dollars converts to different euro amounts depending on the exchange rate. Small differences per bottle become significant at scale and can affect profit for both producer and buyer. The industry uses several methods to mitigate currency risk. Options can reserve stock or even currency at agreed terms, often with a premium because the producer takes the risk the buyer may not follow through. Some buyers want prices fixed in the importer's currency at the date of ordering, which shifts risk to the producer and may increase the price. Larger companies may buy currency proactively to cover orders. Some importers use contracts to fix exchange rates with banks for set amounts on specified dates, providing budgeting certainty. In countries with unstable currencies, trading in more stable currencies like the US dollar or euro can reduce exposure. Some businesses open foreign currency accounts locally or overseas, but regulations differ, and holding large sums in a current account is not always an efficient use of funds. So, when you step back, the message of this chapter is beautifully simple. Wine price is built from costs that begin long before a grape exists and continue long after the wine is bottled. Land, labor, machinery, water energy, maturation, cash flow, packaging, freight, insurance, duties, labels, margins, rent, staff, marketing, and currency risk. Every one of those can be small for one wine and decisive for another, depending on scale, positioning, route to market, and how replaceable that wine is in the eyes of the buyer. And if you want one exam calibrated sentence to hold on to, it's this: high volume wines survive on efficiency and economy of scale with small margins per unit. Super premium wines survive on high margins per unit because there is no volume to spread costs across. I hope this helps you prep. I'll see you in the next episode when we look at how wine actually gets to market and who takes control along the way.